Okay, we're still trying to look at First Peter, and we're kind of hit and miss with weather and other things that come along. But last time we met, we were talking about, or the last couple of times we met, we were talking about the idea of submission, and it talked about how we ought to submit to rulers, governing authorities. It talked about how that slaves ought to submit to masters, and it talked about how wives ought to submit to husbands. And in each one of those, we talked about how difficult that sometimes is for all of us. First of all, there is built into each of us kind of a little tiny spirit of rebellion. You kind of agree with that? There's just a little bit of something inside of me that says I don't like people telling me what to do. So we battle with that. It gets even worse when we have people who are in authority over us, and we don't think they're working for our good. In fact, we think they're working for our harm. It gets even harder. But as I look at all this, and I realize we're, as Christians, supposed to be good citizens, and we're supposed to be good slaves, or we like to say today, employees. And we're supposed to be good wives. Do you know the hardest one of this whole bunch may be at the end for the readers who would have read this in Paul's day? Because Paul, as he talks in chapter 3 about wives and how important it is to have inner beauty, and not to focus so much on the outer beauty, he then turns the attention to husbands. And he says, husbands, in verse 7 of chapter 3, in the same way be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. And I talked last week about the culture into which this was injected in the first century. And the culture into which this was injected was a culture where what kind of rights did a woman have? Virtually none. Virtually none. And they were totally subservient to their husbands and to other males, and they had literally no choices in many ways. It was a forced type thing. So if I'm reading this as a Christian, and I'm reading this letter that Peter has written, and I receive it, all of a sudden he has said something that is probably more new and more different than I've heard in a long time. I understand what it is to be obedient to Rome. I understand what it is in this slavery industry that we have in that culture for slaves to be mindful that they're supposed to serve their masters. And I understand that wives are supposed to be submissive. I've grown up in that culture my whole life. But for him to turn and say now to me as a husband, you better be considerate of your wife. And you better share with her in this new life that God has given you. And then he has a remarkable statement at the end. And I don't know if that remarkable statement would apply to citizens of a ruler, like a king or a governor or whatever. And I don't know if this statement applies to slaves. And I don't know if this statement applies to women as they are servants or husband. All it seems to apply right here is, husbands, if you aren't treating your wife correctly, your prayers are what?
Hindered.
They're hindered. Now that ought to bother every one of us. Should it bother every one of us? Maybe it's my age, but I just want to tell you a little bit right here that I think now more than ever before that prayer is important and prayer is powerful. And I have been speaking here at this place for a long time now about the Spirit that lives within us. And I've been speaking that for not just the last few weeks, I've been speaking this for a long time. The prayer part over a long period of time is what's so important. And without it, I would be afraid to make a decision, because I'm making a decision more on what I think and what I believe and what I want, and I'm not sure I'm right. And so that prayer, tell me what I need to know and tell me what I need to say, please, seemed to help. And I find myself praying that over and over again in situations. I walk into groups, I walk into meetings. What do I need to know? What do I need to say? And it seems to me to say, if I don't act right, God's not so inclined to listen to me and help me. Does that make any sense to you? And now he follows that with, watch what he says next. Finally, all of you. Now I think that includes over here those who are supposed to be submissive to the rulers, those who are supposed to be submissive to those who own them. I don't even like that term, own them, do you? That's disgusting to me, that we have had eras of time in the history of this world where one person would own another. That's disgusting and wrong to me. But to those who are slaves to some kind of a master, and to wives who are supposed to be submissive to husbands, and to husbands who are supposed to be really good to their wives, to all of you, I want you to live in harmony with one another. And I pause there and I think about that, and I think, do you realize how difficult it is for us to live in harmony with each other? Do you really realize that? Would you just pause to think about how much division and ugliness and fighting that goes on day after day after day, everywhere? And would it surprise you to think and to know that right in the heart of churches, that is so hard to maintain? I just finished reading a book on church history. And this book is a really well-written book on the history of where we came from. Someone asked me just today what I thought of that book. And I said, well, I would read one section of it, one little few pages, and I'd think that's really interesting. I'd read another few pages and get almost so upset with it, I'd have to get up and leave the book because of hard-headed, arrogant, forceful people pushing their way on other people who are just trying to be Christians and calling them names and saying that they're whatever. And I thought, how, of all places. And what really aggravated me is that some of those things that were done in the 1840s and carried it to the 1940s have been carried through to today, and we're still doing it. We're still arguing about it. And we're still having a lack of harmony because of it. And I'm thinking, of all places. And by the way, he's talking to us in this place. Finally, all of you live in harmony with everyone. quit the fighting and quit the arguing and quit all the stuff that's causing so much trouble, and learn to live in harmony. And I don't do so well at that sometimes either. I don't do so well at that. And be sympathetic. We're living in a world that's less sympathetic and less empathetic than it's ever been, perhaps. Love his brothers, and be compassionate, and be humble. And if you ever underline stuff, underline the word humble. We have a hard time with that too. We have a hard time with that too. When people brag on you, I'm telling you, just take it with a grain of salt. It may be not as good as they're saying, and they may be doing it for ulterior motives and reasons. I had a person say to me not very long ago, and it happened to me many times, said, "Don't flatter me." And I leaned across and looked at him and said, "I don't flatter anyone, because flattery is a lie. Flattery is something that I say good about you for my benefit. It's called buttering you up." I said, "A compliment is something I say good about you for your benefit. I don't flatter." But sometimes we don't know how to handle all that, and we get to thinking we're really pretty good, and humility is hard to find. And I was reading today one of the symptoms of the downfall of universities, and it said they have lost their humility. They have lost their humility. And
they've been saying it ever since Proverbs, though.
They've been saying it ever since Proverbs. I saw a post on LinkedIn from a former student of mine at Lubbock Christian, who's now a CEO of a company I wish I was CEO of, because he probably makes a couple million a year, and he probably is going to, when that company sells, be a multi-millionaire. I have no doubt about that. And he said, there's a little book I just want to recommend to everybody, How the Mighty Fall. And I responded, which I rarely do, with a comment, and said, it's the unknown sequel that Jim Collins wrote of the book Good to Great. And if you look at the book Good to Great, he does research on over 400 companies and said there only 11 made the leap from being a good company to a truly great company. And he had these statistics by which he measured all this. But what people don't know is a little tiny book, How the Mighty Fall, where he was sitting at West Point giving a speech, and a panel was out there in front of him, and someone in the panel said, what happened to some of those companies that became great companies in your first book that was sold millions and millions of copies? And he said, I was embarrassed because I didn't know. And I went back to my team of researchers and said, what happened? Have you ever heard of Circuit City, for example? If you lived in a big city like Lubbock, Circuit City was the giant. By the time Jim Collins wrote How the Mighty Fall, Circuit City was out of business and bankrupt, because they thought they could get into the car business and have something like CarMax and knock the world, because they're really smart. And he said, I'll tell you why mighty fall, because they become prideful. He said that's the number one reason. And he had all kinds of illustrations of his companies that he said had made the leap from good to great, and now they're out of business because they forgot how to be humble. So, and we have some people among us. I mean, if Greg McKee would wear all of his state championship rings in here, he don't have enough fingers. He could loan me one or two. But he doesn't act like he's that kind of coach. He didn't act like he's, he acts like kind of a bumbling nobody, I mean, that didn't come out right. That was kind of like my lawyer doing. Yeah, like clocks over. Yeah, so he just acts like one of us. Okay, just an humble guy. So be good citizens. Don't let your prayers get hindered. Do your best to live in harmony. As hard as it is, do your best to live in harmony with everybody. And be sympathetic and love as brothers and be compassionate. And try really hard to be humble people. Does that work? A cold, wet Wednesday night when Greg wants to get home? Let's stop.